Assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome. Welcome to an exclusive by Aaj Network. Pakistan is going through a very troubled and harrowing catastrophe. We all know that the floods have inherently displaced about 33 million people and a third of the country is underwater. Perspective is everything. A time when Pakistan needs world support, how is the world actually viewing the country and its present regime? Let's have a conversation about that as we have with us a senior South Asian associate of the Wilson Center who is now leading as the director of the South Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Let's welcome Mr. Michael Kugelman. Hello Michael, thank you very much for making time for us today. You come to Pakistan at a harrowing time and I'd like to begin this conversation by taking you back to a book that you co-authored back in 2011, Hungry Bellies, Broken Dreams. It's about food insecurity and the future of Pakistan. Unfortunately, it's a similar scenario right now, as you yourself have pointed out in your recent opinion piece, that this flood crisis could become a food crisis. If I was to ask you what are some of the similarities and differences that you see in the aftermath of the 2010 and the 2022 floods, what would your response be?
So first of all, thank you for having me. The similarities in terms of 2010 and 2022, as I see them, are that we did have immediate responses from the international community. That's very clear. In both cases, you had large-scale responses from many countries, from countries as well as from multilateral organizations. But the big difference, and this is a very troubling difference, is that the response was much larger in 2010. I would argue that we're seeing much less of a response this time, even though there has been a significant response. We have not had as many countries, for example, responding with pledges and of assistance in this case. And I think there's several reasons for that. One, if you look at the case of the United States, back in 2010, the U.S. was in Afghanistan. It was fighting a war there. So it was very easy for it to deploy military helicopters to come in to help evacuate stranded people in 2010. Of course, the U.S. has left Afghanistan, so it's not as easy for the U.S. to mobilize with military aircraft, even though that is happening this time, but not as much. I'd also argue that there are so many other major humanitarian crises going on right now that you didn't have as much of back in 2010. The war in Ukraine has triggered a horrific humanitarian crisis. Afghanistan has a terrible humanitarian crisis. Yemen as well, and there are others. So I think donor fatigue is much more of an issue now than it was in 2010. And final point, the global economy has been experiencing major shocks now that were not there back in 2010. Pandemic-induced shocks and also shocks induced by the war in Ukraine in terms of skyrocketing commodity costs. So this all means that the environment, unfortunately, is not as favorable for such a large-scale international response to these floods in the way that you had back in 2010. And this is problematic because these floods are so much worse than the ones in 2010, as catastrophic as the ones back then were as well.
Michael, you've visited the National Command Center that is working day and night for flood relief and rescue and rehabilitation. But also in your opinion piece, you mentioned that bad ecological governance failures may exacerbate the situation further. What are some of your observations in terms of how Pakistan's government are handling the situation?
So the important thing to note is that no government, no matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, no matter how good it might have been at ecological governance, could have prevented these types of floods, right? They were triggered by rains. No government can prevent rain from falling. No government can prevent early monsoons. But what I've gotten into in some of my recent analyses is that indeed we've seen in previous decades how a number of Pakistani governments have not taken the type of steps that could have at least reduced the most serious consequences of these floods and other major weather events like them, right? If there had been more efforts, for example, to better regulate these building construction along rivers, these encroachments, as I know they're described as here. If there had been more efforts to rein that in, then that could have reduced some of the damage. Also, deforestation, which for many years has been a major issue here, the rate of deforestation has slowed a bit in recent years, but that's still a major problem. And of course, deforestation, once you remove all these trees, then you remove natural bulwarks to prevent the spread of floodwaters. There's that. I would also argue if there had been better efforts to ensure that water infrastructure was better repaired and better maintained so that it's not as dilapidated, that could have prevented things from getting as bad. Again, even the most foolproof water infrastructure would not have stopped these horrific floods. But at least if they were better maintained and better working, at least I think that something could have been done to reduce the most catastrophic, serious implications of these floods.
But Michael, when we say that weather will be weather and the governments and the prime ministers cannot control how much it would rain or how how foggy would it be, it kind of reminds me back to Winston Churchill's infamous words from 1952 when the fog descended on London, that the prime minister cannot be expected to look at the fog. But another question that comes to mind is, and this is most commonly cited by most climate experts of Pakistan and abroad, that Pakistan's contribution to the carbon emissions is less than 1%. But we tend to be in the top of the countries that would be most vulnerable to climate impact. Do you feel the West in particular owes Pakistan climate change reparations?
I think that the West, and not just the West, because it's not only the West that's a big emitter. China is a major emitter, as you know. I think that these countries that have had such polluting policies for so long do owe it to Pakistan and other climate vulnerable countries that have not contributed to global warming that way. They owe it to these countries to do something. But reparations, that term is a very delicate term. I think that this debate should take place, but maybe more in terms of how the world can provide more long-term climate adaptation assistance to Pakistan and other countries. And I think it's a very realistic and a very important goal to focus on. And I think that, unfortunately, there's a good chance that in the next few weeks, media coverage is going to reduce a bit in terms of focusing on these floods. And I think that this immediate relief coming from the international donor community is going to end as well. But clearly, Pakistan needs help, not just now, but for the long term. So I think there needs to be a conversation about how the U.S. and other countries in the West, as well as China, can think of ways to help Pakistan make itself more climate resilient, whether that entails helping Pakistan develop the technologies to come up to craft the early warning systems or better early warning systems, or whether there can be efforts to help Pakistan be in a position to have the resources to generate more foolproof building materials so that you have stronger buildings that don't easily come down when you have catastrophic weather events. I think that is where the debate needs to lie. I absolutely understand the desire to talk about climate justice and specifically the issue of climate reparations, but I think that in some countries, including the United States for that matter, it would be more realistic and more practical to talk about this from the context of longer-term international climate adaptation and mitigation assistance, how we can get more of that to Pakistan.
I think more about disaster management and preparedness would be the way forward for the years to come. And how is India responding to it? We realize that there are very ambitious targets set for 2070 where it wants to have net zero emissions. And even at the recent COP26, Prime Minister Modi spoke about and actually elaborated on the five-fold strategy, which is called the Panchimta. A lot of the people, analysts around the world, are calling it to be purpose washing and sort of like a diplomatic deflection, because India has been lambasted as one of the bigger polluters and emitters of 2019 after US and China. What's your take on it?
I think it is significant that we started to see these ambitious pledges from the Indian government at these climate conferences. That's important. The pledges to reduce emissions, even getting to net zero within the next few decades. Those may be aspirational and unrealistic, but it's important because for a long time India was one of these countries that made the argument that since the industrialized developed world polluted for so long, we have a right to do that as well, and there's no need for us to reduce our emissions just because the rest of the world wants us to. So this is a bit of a shift in India's policy, which is important. But for me, what I think of, if you look at India's energy situation, if you look at its energy mix, it continues to be heavily dependent on coal, and dirty coal, the dirtiest types of coal. And there's no indication that that's going to change. Indian officials have indeed acknowledged that they're going to continue to rely heavily on coal. So if you're going to do that, well, that sort of makes it difficult to believe that these proposed pledges are actually going to come true when they're supposed to. So I think it's important that India wants to change the debate and change its policy and be more willing to make these drastic reductions in emissions, but its actual policies, as indicated by actual officials, suggests that it's nowhere near getting to that point anytime soon.
And looking at the situation in the region, with China experiencing one of the worst droughts and Pakistan experiencing one of the worst floods, and with 1/3 of the country being underwater, do you believe that there will be global pressure on India to do more?
There should be. I think there has been. I think that India tends to get what I would describe as it gets passes, it gets free passes for doing certain things that other countries wouldn't get free passes on. But I think when it comes to emissions, absolutely. I mean, much of the world, certainly the West, recognizes that climate change mitigation is a key goal, and you have to look at top emitters. India is not up there with the U.S. and China by any means, but certainly India, of course, is going to be the most populous country in the world, a major contributor to climate change. Indeed, I think there has to be a concerted effort to ensure that India changes its incentive structure, so to speak, so that it begins to make these necessary changes. But India, of course, is a big part of the global community. It has very good ties with the West. I don't think that pressure has to be the word to use at this point. I think talks, negotiations should be the way to go. India's government appears very keen to engage and wants to be at the table when it comes to these really important climate negotiations. So let's see how that goes. But indeed, I do think that we could start to see what I would describe perhaps as pressure in the coming years, assuming that India's patterns of energy consumption continue, and I imagine that they will.
Talking about the pressures and the table talk, do you see, looking back, White House did not invite the then Prime Minister Imran Khan to the White House Climate Change Conference, where 40 other world leaders were present, and of course the vulnerability to climate impact was one of the key criteria. Looking back, do you think it was an oversight, or was it a telltale sign that all was not well between Washington and Prime Minister Khan?
It's very difficult to say. I know that many here think that it was an intentional snub, that essentially the U.S. didn't want to deal with Pakistan on that level, and so was not going to invite it to the conference. I don't know for sure. My sense, and I've written to this effect, my sense of it likely was an oversight, in the sense that unfortunately the U.S. has tended to look at Pakistan through a very narrow lens over the last few decades, mainly one that revolves around security and Afghanistan-related issues. And so I think that for the U.S. it certainly wanted to invite a mix of countries to that summit, but Pakistan didn't come to mind just because Pakistan didn't occupy that type of strategic focus that other countries that were invited to the summit were. And also, at the time when that climate summit happened, it was a pretty key moment for U.S.-Pakistan relations, and the U.S. was looking to Pakistan to help, to help as the U.S. effected its withdrawal and was closely in touch with Pakistan. I don't think the U.S. would have wanted to intentionally anger Pakistan by snubbing it. So who knows for sure? I don't know for sure. But I'd like to hope that it was not a deliberate snub. If it was a deliberate snub, even if it wasn't a deliberate snub, the fact that Imran Khan was not invited to that climate summit, I think that right now, given what's happened over the last 2 weeks, it's now very clear how much of a mistake that was, given Pakistan's incredibly acute vulnerability to climate change.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that US has always seen Pakistan through the AfPak or the Indo-Pak lens, and although there was acute vulnerability when it came to climate impact, Pakistan was not top of mind there. But 1 year on, as we see Taliban have gained control of Afghanistan, what does that mean for the region? We'll talk about that right after this short break. Welcome back after the break. We are still in conversation with Michael Kugelman, the Director of South Asia Program at the Wilson Center. Before the break, we've been talking about how the region has been impacted with the recent developments, both in terms of the regime change in Pakistan, the extreme economic vulnerabilities of many of the South Asian countries, and also we were speaking about how a year on after US has exited from Afghanistan and the Taliban have gained power, they seem to be in no mood for sharing that power. Michael, what are your observations? What are now the interests and stakes of US in the region, particularly with reference to the Taliban regime in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so for many years, the U.S., I would argue, viewed South Asia through several separate silos. One would be the war in Afghanistan, which of course it fought for nearly 20 years. Another would be strengthening its relationship with India. and another would be working with Pakistan to the extent possible. And unfortunately, beyond that, I would argue that the U.S. tended to overlook the rest of South Asia. So I think that there is an opportunity, now that America is no longer in Afghanistan, to try to give South Asia the proper full geographic focus that it deserves. But I think what we're starting to see happen, and I don't think this is a good thing, is that those three separate silos, they've been eliminated, but now the U.S. is increasingly looking at South Asia through the lens of China. And as you know, U.S.-China competition is one of the big stories in global politics now. It's a top issue for U.S. foreign policy. All U.S. foreign policy considerations are shaped through that competition with China. So what I think you're going to see now is the U.S. try to deepen its relations with all of the countries of South Asia, which is a good thing. But the unfortunate thing, in my view, is that the goal here will be to try to wean these countries in South Asia away from their economic relationships and cooperation with China, in the hopes that they would be more willing to work more closely with India. Of course, the U.S. and India are working closely. This is problematic because, in my view, the countries of South Asia, setting aside Pakistan and India, the smaller countries of South Asia would like to balance their relations with both China and India and the U.S. So this is a bit problematic. The U.S. certainly is still keeping an eye on Afghanistan. Its interests in Afghanistan are much more narrowly focused than they were when U.S. forces were on the ground. The humanitarian situation is a big focus of U.S. attention and will continue to be. But Washington's hands are tied to a great degree because of the sanctions regime on the Taliban. So this means that the U.S. really can't do much to provide broader economic assistance to Afghanistan beyond the humanitarian assistance, which, of course, is really problematic for the Afghan people. We're also seeing that the U.S. continues to focus on the issue of counterterrorism in Afghanistan. Now that we know that Ayman al-Zawahiri was eliminated in the U.S. mission, that shows that the U.S. has developed the ability to project power, not power, but project the ability to engage in counterterrorism activities, monitoring and targeting threats there. And if you look at the U.S. experience in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, much of it revolved around counterterrorism. That is why U.S. forces entered in 2001. I'd argue it's a big reason why they stayed there for many years, and it's a big reason why they left. President Biden said that U.S. counterterrorism goals have been achieved. It's ironic because you have a new threat, a new terrorist threat in Afghanistan, Daesh, or Islamic State Khorasan, which did not exist before U.S. troops entered. So, bottom line, the U.S. will continue to be focused on Afghanistan, albeit with much more narrowly focused goals than over the last 20 years.
But is there any cognizance and understanding of the kind of pressures both the countries, when it comes to Afghanistan and Pakistan, are facing, especially in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals indicators? We've recently had the Asia Cup Pakistan-Afghanistan match, and if we were to look at it from a cultural diplomacy angle, from a cricket diplomacy angle, there was a palpable level of aggression and animosity between the fans of both countries, and we saw a depiction of that at the Sharjah Stadium. What does that mean for the people-to-people linkages of the two countries, and how do you see Afghanistan and Pakistan working together in the future?
That's very troubling, and I would like to think that unfortunate incident that happened at that cricket match is an anomaly. It's not something that ordinarily happened. There are actually, for all we talk about the tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan, there's some big success stories with people-to-people relations, and of course, given the geographies, a lot of crossovers. Many Afghans have connections in Pakistan, and so on. So I like to think that the people-to-people relations will remain strong, but indeed, it's been a fraught relationship for many years, and many Afghans are deeply unhappy with Pakistan's policies in Afghanistan for many years. That's not easy to overcome. And also what we've seen since the Taliban takeover and the U.S. withdrawal is that the relationship between Pakistan and the new government, the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, has become very fraught because the Taliban has not really helped Pakistan as it would have liked it to deal with Pakistan's terrorism concerns in Afghanistan, namely the TTP. And of course, we've seen the Taliban regime pick up where previous Afghan governments over the last few decades have picked up with this apparent opposition or even rejection of the border, the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. So, you're having some tensions on people-to-people levels, and what may be a surprise to some in Pakistan is that you're continuing to have tensions with the new regime even though one would have thought that perhaps having the Taliban in control in Afghanistan would make it a bit easier for Pakistan to conduct relations with Afghanistan after there had been quite a few years of tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan, especially with India having had very good relations with the non-Taliban government over the last few decades in Afghanistan.
Just like you pointed out repeatedly that there is a looming food crisis, and you've also mentioned that the US and the world looks at the humanitarian crisis brewing in Afghanistan and Pakistan. There continue to be 5 million plus refugees, Afghan refugees, being hosted by the country for the last 4 decades. With the looming food crisis, do you think more help will arrive?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think that if there's a silver lining, this has been a discussion with a lot of negative, bad news, but the war has ended in Afghanistan for now. And for the first time in nearly 4 decades, there's no active war. So I think that at the least, you're not going to have the conflict-driven refugees coming into Pakistan that you had in the past. But indeed, those fleeing Taliban rule, those concluding that the economic situation is not working for them, those worried about terrorism, those wanting their children, especially their girls, to have better chances of an education. For all these reasons, you still have many Afghans going into Pakistan. And Pakistan, of course, I don't need to tell this audience, has hosted Afghan refugees for many, many years. And so, we see that it never gets easier the more it's done. So I really think there's a lot more that the world could do on this front. And certainly, the UN has been very active, has been very helpful for quite some time. But indeed, given that the international community is not doing as much as it otherwise could do because of the sanctions regime, one could argue that it really should be stepping up to help more with other humanitarian issues, especially the refugee crisis, for sure. But at the end of the day, this is a case where geography can be problematic for Pakistan. It borders Afghanistan, so it's invariable that these refugee flows are going to target Pakistan in many cases, just like you have many Afghan refugees that have tried to enter Iran. But we're also seeing them try to go to Europe via the Mediterranean Sea. So we are starting to see different dynamics in that sense. But absolutely, I wish that the world could do more to not only help Afghan refugees, but also help those countries that are taking them in, particularly Pakistan. But one has to hope that these refugees continue to be treated well in Pakistan. And this has been a concern.
It's interesting that you mentioned the European outlook on conflict and the crisis of refugees. It's bound to be a busy week in the coming days in New York as the world prepares for the UN General Assembly. And once again, the kind of response we've had to the Russia-Ukraine conflict from the South Asian countries is rather subdued. And we almost find ourselves at the peripherals of it. But you in your latest piece also mentioned that Moscow has no enemies in South Asia. In fact, it has a friend in New Delhi. What are your observations regarding that?
Well, it's true. If you look back, first of all, if you look at the first main UN resolution that was passed criticizing, condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, half of the SAARC countries abstained, which is pretty significant. So 4 out of the 8 South Asian countries did not vote in favor to criticize the invasion, which is pretty significant. If you go back in history, going back to the Cold War, the Soviet Union had pretty good relations with many countries in South Asia. And even looking in more recent years, setting aside India, we've seen Russia make some significant investments in different countries in South Asia. In Bangladesh, for example, the Russians have invested in some of the energy sector in Bangladesh. There's also explored options for that in Nepal. India, of course, is a whole different story in the sense that it's a deep friendship that goes back to the Cold War. And India has never been willing to call out its Russian friend in global forums, including at the UN. So it's not that surprising that India has taken the position it did. It is notable, though, at the SCO conference that Prime Minister Modi did while facing Putin, essentially say, "We got to end this war, Vladimir," and is basically what he was implying. But yeah, so South Asia is not the region that the U.S. should look to in its efforts to galvanize the global community and get the world to work with the U.S. as one to press Russia to end this war. I mean, that's not what this region wants to do. And I think it's important for the U.S. and its Western partners to accept that. And it's tough for India because some of India's closest partners happen to be the toughest critics of Moscow. Washington, Canberra, Tokyo, the Quad countries. They want to see stronger pressure on Russia, but India's not going to go there And other countries in South Asia are not as well, and I think it's important to accept that. That's what their interest says should be done, and that's fine.
Michael, I'd love to shift gears now and move towards the domestic politics of Pakistan and how you see the regime change. Does that put the government at the helm of affairs right now in a better position to handle the challenges, especially the economic challenges and the management of the disaster these ongoing floods have brought in? But we'll talk about that right after this short break. Welcome back after the break. You're watching an Aaj exclusive and we're in conversation with Michael Kugelman, the Director for South Asia Program at the Wilson Center. Now shifting to the possibility of how the present government in Pakistan is poised to actually make a difference and to tackle the various challenges, be they be political, be they be economic, and of course the disaster when it comes to the natural catastrophe of the flooding. Michael, what is your take? I was rather surprised when I noticed that in one of the programs where you were commenting about the regime change and Prime Minister Imran Khan being ousted by a no-confidence movement, you didn't see that as a surprise. You saw it coming for a while, although it surprised a lot of us in Pakistan.
Well, it appeared for quite some time that what had been the opposition, the PDM, was trying to do something to remove Imran Khan from power. I don't know. I don't remember what specifically you're referring to when I said I was surprised, but it's obviously the type of thing that the PDM, in my view, would not have had the ability on its own to succeed in an effort to oust the elected prime minister from power unless it had some help from key quarters. And the PDM, when it was in the opposition, it hosted a number of rallies, but I think it really struggled to galvanize, to really bring huge amounts of people onto the streets to get behind its cause. So I think once it became clear it would be able to get some assistance, then I thought that it would not be as difficult to pull off what it did. But indeed, it was an unprecedented situation because, correct me if I'm wrong, there's never been a time in Pakistan's history where where a prime minister was actually ousted in a no-confidence vote. Those efforts have typically been unsuccessful. So in that sense, that is a bit surprising. But my view is that the conditions, I would argue, the political conditions gave the opposition a good chance, a chance to do something that ordinarily it may not have had.
I believe your comments were to the tune of how the political parties in Pakistan have never really respected the electoral calendar and would pounce on any opportunity where they see a weakness in a certain regime. But what is your opinion and what is the world's opinion about Imran Khan? Sometimes he's dubbed infamously as Taliban Khan for being supportive of the Taliban regime. But very recently, the opposition he faces at home in Pakistan is labeling him and accusing him for following a rather liberal and a secular agenda. What's your understanding of the enigma that Khan is?
A good way to describe him, and it's impossible to do justice to him in a quick response. A very complex character for sure. I think that he's admirable in the sense that his set of values and principles is so different from what really every past Pakistani prime minister or even political party has brought to the table. His relentless focus on corruption, his distinguishing himself from the mainstream political parties and political figures who tend to come from dynastic backgrounds, and many have been hounded by corruption allegations. He is a clean figure, so to speak. He doesn't come from a dynastic family. And what I personally admire about him is how he has been such a philanthropist as a political figure. His role in building that hospital, that cancer hospital, it's very impressive. But indeed, his views and his tone and his messaging, in terms of how he conveys his views about a number of things, including U.S. policy, certainly is something that I think has made it difficult at times for him to work with the West. And I'm not just speaking about the things he said during the last few months of his time in power. I'm talking about his positions more broadly, the things he said about the war in Afghanistan, the things that he said about the Taliban, for sure. But that said, I think it's what many outside Pakistan don't recognize, and I try as an outside analyst of Pakistan, I try to highlight the fact that he has been very successful. He has a huge popular following because of his ability to tap into these long-held grievances harbored by so many in Pakistan. This idea that politics has been corrupted for so long, and that it's time for a fresh start. It's time for things to be done differently. As you know, I think that's very. He's done that very well over the years.
Captures imaginations to the very best.
Right, and you know, one could call that populism, which I think it is. But you know, I think it's important to acknowledge that, because many in the West just think that he's gotten a lot of help from powerful quarters. That doesn't give him the credit that he deserves for the way in which he's risen to the top as a political figure. But that said, yeah, the things he says and the way he says them on a number of policy issues, particularly with the U.S., makes things very difficult. And certainly the things that he said during his last few weeks in power, he's got a long road ahead of him, to be quite candid, if he were to return to power, in terms of how he repairs his relations with the U.S. That'll be a big challenge for him. See, this is the problem with the current political situation in Pakistan. And again, I speak as an outside analyst. I don't mean to, I really don't want to speak for Pakistan. This is just an outside perspective. The current political moment is so rife with polarization that a huge opportunity has been squandered. In the aftermath of these terrible floods, ideally, Imran Khan would work together with the government. Imran Khan has a huge advantage, his ability to mobilize, his ability to receive pledges of assistance from the diaspora and from the world on the whole. The government could really benefit from that assistance if they were to work together. But you know, as you know, Khan is at loggerheads with the government. And so they're working at cross purposes, working separately. And that's not going to help matters at a moment when I would think, as an outsider, the country needs to come together, including the political class.
Speaking of established political parties and families, we have a young foreign minister who has a big ask of him right now. We're troubled from every angle. What do you think Bilawal Bhutto Zardari's role can be in bringing the various political forces together and for galvanizing support for Pakistan in the international arena?
Right. Well, he'll have an opportunity very soon, as will the Prime Minister. They're both going to be in New York, I believe, and that's a great platform to try to make a major plea for more assistance. So I'm sure that Prime Minister Sharif will use his speech at the UN General Assembly to make that pitch for more flood assistance. But you know, the Foreign Minister, absolutely. I think that at this point, Pakistan's main foreign policy priority has to be to work with partners to try to convince them to provide as much assistance as possible. It's not the most advanced, sophisticated foreign policy, but given Pakistan's needs, which of course go beyond flood assistance and extend to economic needs as well, you know, the IMF package that came in, you know, it's $1 billion or so. Given the $20-30 billion in flood damages, that IMF package is not going to be nearly enough. So I think the foreign minister will have to wear the hat of both the foreign minister and a finance minister, in the sense that he needs to go out there and try to ensure that his working with partners, allies of Pakistan, as well as friends and others, to try to impress upon them the importance of providing assistance. It's not healthy. I'm not saying that he should go out with the beggar bowl or anything like that, but there's never been a more important time for Pakistan to solidify its key partnerships, try to improve relations with key donor countries in the West as well, to ensure that you could have the economic cooperation needed to help Pakistan get through these very difficult times.
Michael, thank you for your candor and your insight on these issues. It really gives us a holistic view of how the world, and especially the world outside Pakistan, is viewing our problems. And in the end, once again, congratulations on being at the helm of affairs and being the director of the South Asia program at the Wilson Center. I understand that there's a Pakistan fellowship that is being announced and offered to journalists and researchers from Pakistan. Could you let us know a little more about that?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. So it's open to everyone, journalists, scholars, business people, anyone that would like to apply, so long as you are from Pakistan and based in Pakistan, and so long as you have at least 8 years of relevant experience in your field. The goal here is to bring someone to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., to spend 9 months working on a research project. It's funded. And it's what we see it as an opportunity to bring new Pakistani voices to Washington, to contribute to debates, policy debates on Pakistan and U.S.-Pakistan relations at a moment when the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, the future of it, is a bit unsettled. And we really care a lot about hearing from Pakistanis, and especially those that aren't typically heard in Washington. So that's why the idea is to bring someone from Pakistan to Washington to contribute. So the deadline to apply is October 1st. So it's coming up, but the information is on our website, and we look forward to receiving our first fellow, hopefully in residence by the end of this year.
Thank you very much for that. So actually bringing the voices that are unheard to plead the case of those who are unserved or rather underserved. Pakistan has a major ground to cover with a variety of problems facing it, and of course the US-Pakistan relations being unsettled to describe it at the very best. Thank you very much. It was Michael Kugelman, the director of the South Asia program at Wilson Center, speaking to us exclusively for Aaj Network. Please do send us your comments and feedback about this conversation. Till then, take good care of yourself. Khuda Hafiz.